Clara Westbrook stood in front of a large, ornate mirror, gazing into her reflection. There was something off about her reflection. Her eyes seemed darker, and the shadows underneath them were deeper than they had been before. It was as if the person looking back at her wasn't entirely her. It made her stomach churn, but she quickly shook off the thought. Clara had lived through traumatic experiences, but this feeling was something different. It was the sensation of watching herself lose her grip on reality. She couldn't quite place it, but it felt like someone, or something, was pulling her into a darkness that she couldn't escape. As her breath began to quicken, she snapped out of it and turned away from the mirror. She could already feel the creeping presence again, but Clara wasn't sure if it was in her mind or if it was something more. Clara Westbrook returned to her hometown of Briarwood, a place she hadn't seen in years. She had grown up here, but she never wanted to return. Too many memories. The house her family had lived in was now an abandoned shell, overtaken by weeds and neglect. Yet it still held the ghosts of her childhood, a place of nightmares she could never quite outrun. Her mother had died suddenly a week ago, and Clara found herself with no choice but to come back. The circumstances surrounding her mother's death were vague, but Clara was never able to get along with her. As a child, her mother's mental health had been a constant source of tension in their home. It felt like Clara had spent most of her life trying to understand what happened to her mother, but there were never any answers. Clara had hoped that returning to Briarwood would give her the closure she needed, but as she stood in front of the old house, she couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The house was more than just a building. It was a prison of memories. Clara ventured inside, a mix of dread and curiosity pulling her through the door. The house was covered in a thick layer of dust. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the once beautiful wallpaper was peeling from the walls. As she explored, she stumbled upon an old photograph of her mother. It was a picture of a younger version of herself, holding Clara's hand. But there was something unsettling about the photograph. Her mother's smile was forced, and her eyes were distant, lost in a place Clara could never reach. That night, Clara tried to sleep, but she couldn't. The house creaked with strange noises, and every time she closed her eyes, she could feel her mother's presence hovering nearby. It wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. She opened her eyes to see a shadow in the corner of the room, a figure standing in the doorway. Clara's heart raced. She jumped out of bed, but when she turned on the light, the shadow was gone. Clara began hearing voices. It started as whispers, so soft that she couldn't tell if they were real or imagined. But the whispers soon turned into clear words, words that she recognized from her childhood. Clara, Clara, come to me. Her mother's voice. It sounded like a plea, like an invitation. She tried to ignore it, but the voices grew louder. During the day, while Clara was at the town library trying to find any old documents that might explain her mother's behavior, she would hear her name called out. At night, it was even worse. The whispers would become screams, urging her to find something, anything, hidden deep in the house. Clara's mind began to crack under the strain. She wasn't sure if the voices were a result of the grief she hadn't processed, or if there was something supernatural at play. She found herself increasingly drawn to the attic. There was something about it, a pull that she couldn't explain. As she climbed the creaky stairs to the attic, she had to resist the urge to turn back. It felt like the house itself was guiding her, or perhaps manipulating her. In the attic, she found a journal. The journal was a dark confession. Clara read it, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mother's words were frantic, filled with fear and obsession. Clara learned that her mother had been diagnosed with a severe form of dissociative identity disorder. But that wasn't all. Her mother had been seeing things that weren't there. I see them every night. They whisper to me, tell me things that I don't understand. They want me to do something, but I can't. They want me to hurt her. I don't want to, but the voices won't stop. They tell me it's the only way. Clara was horrified. She had no idea that her mother had been struggling with this kind of mental illness, but the final entry was the most chilling. The mirror is the doorway. I can see her. She's always been there, watching. She will take me just like the others. She's already taken me once. Clara could feel the air around her grow colder as she read those words. She felt like something was watching her. Something was in the room with her. Clara found the mirror. Her mother's journal had mentioned a mirror, a large, ornate piece that had been in the house for as long as Clara could remember. It was hidden in a back room, covered by a sheet. Clara knew she had to face it. She had to understand what had driven her mother to madness. When she uncovered the mirror, Clara froze. The reflection wasn't just hers. It was something more. A shadow lurked behind her, its shape indistinct. The figure seemed to move on its own, as though it was alive. She reached out to touch the mirror, but as her fingers brushed the surface, the reflection of her own hand didn't follow. Instead, she saw another hand, long, pale fingers reaching toward her from the other side. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure in the mirror smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was a twisted, malevolent version of herself. Suddenly, Clara heard the voice again, louder than before. "You've found me, Clara. Now you must take my place." The mirror began to crack, spider-webbing across the glass. Clara's heart raced. She backed away, but her reflection didn't move. It stayed frozen in place, its dark eyes never leaving hers. Clara's grip on reality began to slip. As the days passed, Clara became obsessed with the mirror. The voices continued, and the figure behind the glass began to speak more clearly. It promised her that she could escape the madness if she just let go, if she became it. Clara knew that she was losing herself. The pull of the mirror was irresistible. It promised her freedom, freedom from her mother's haunting presence, freedom from the loneliness that had plagued her for years. She no longer trusted her own mind. She questioned whether she was even Clara Westbrook anymore. She spent hours staring into the mirror, waiting for the figure to take her, to make her whole again. She had already begun to lose track of time. She couldn't remember if it was day or night, only that the reflection in the mirror was the only thing that made sense. Clara stood in front of the mirror one last time. She was different now. The reflection wasn't just her anymore. It was the twisted version of herself, the one that had been watching from the other side. But Clara understood now. She knew what she had to do. The mirror was not a doorway, it was a trap. Clara made a choice. She would not let the reflection take her. She would not become the thing that haunted her mother. She slammed her fist into the mirror, shattering the glass. As the pieces fell to the floor, she felt the weight lift from her chest. The voices stopped. But when she looked down at her bloodied hand, she saw something disturbing. The reflection in the shards of glass still smiled back at her. Clara left the house and never returned. She moved far away, changing her name and starting a new life. But sometimes late at night she could still hear the whispers. And when she looked into a mirror, she would swear that her reflection wasn't entirely her own. The end.